Hello, friends. Welcome back to Off the Bunga Bunga, or BungaCast for short. It's the global politics podcast at the end of history. We're recording this on Thursday, the 21st of January. I'm just stating that in case you think that we're ignoring something, in case something crazy happens between now and when you hear this. But actually, maybe that sense of impending doom, of a massive cataclysm on the way, is maybe part of the problem. Maybe our fantasies, instead of driving us to political action, are complicit with our passivity. Anyway, that's just a starter, something to think about. But it will be something that we'll return to over the course of this episode, because we'll be talking about politics, subjectivity, and fantasy. So speaking about fantasy, I'm going to introduce George and Phil, the objects very much of your fantasy listener, no doubt. Guys, what is your fantasy?
George, you go first.
Oh no! So as a good viewer of the UK version of The Office, I was going to say probably just Two Sisters, me watching. But for listeners who don't get that reference, no, my fancy at the moment is just going to the pub and having a pint of beer and having a conversation with people. It seems this completely ridiculous alien thing that's completely outside of all of our grasps. That's probably my fantasy at now.
We were just saying before recording, we were like recollecting about a kind of slightly annoying pub experience or experience with a certain someone that we know and have been annoyed by in the past. And I thought, wow, that just sounds fantastic. That sounds like the best thing I can imagine right now.
I would risk being pushed into oncoming traffic just to go to the pub.
Phil.
Yeah, my fantasies used to be much more depraved, but then beginning with lockdown, they seem to have become much more gentil, domesticated and reduced to it would be quite nice to see somebody in outside of a supermarket and outside, well, not even at home.
But just, you mean just outside? Nice you want to hang out outside a supermarket, just waiting for you pass by.
Doing some skating, drinking some energy drinks, maybe smoking a couple of cigarettes in the parking lot.
That's not my fantasy, but definitely my fantasies have become more modest and domesticated since we've entered into, since the beginning of lockdown, in fact. So.
Yeah, right. So beyond our mundane fantasies, I'm going to bring in our guest, Benjamin Fong, who teaches at Arizona State University and is the editor of Damage magazine, which both George and I have written for. It's fantastic. We're going to hear a bit more about it as we go along. So I'd like to say firstly hi to Ben. Welcome. And you're and feel free to answer the fantasy question or swerve it.
Yeah, I was going to say we should hear what an American fantasy is like as well.
Yeah. Hey, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. We're a big fan of Outfit Bunga Bunga at Damage Magazine. My fantasies have always been extremely pedestrian, and they've only grown more so during lockdown. Having a beer with other people, it sounds pretty good right now.
Yeah. That's we're kind of doing that virtually. So there's that. There's Zoom. Maybe we'll also talk a little bit about technology towards the end of this as well, and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and maybe with a bit more sophistication than that. Ben's just
the jury is still out.
Yeah, exactly. Very much so. Very much out. Okay, let's actually get properly started. Biden was inaugurated yesterday, and maybe that's a good place to start. I've characterized it, and I don't think I'm the only one, as liberal authoritarianism with woke characteristics. So maybe that's where we should start. Do you think that's an appropriate characterization of what the Biden regime will be, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's basically right. And I listened to your all's episode with Daniel Bessner and Amber Frost, and I agree with everything there. A return to the neoliberal center, but with woke characteristics. That does seem, more or less what we're headed for. But I don't think, there's certainly cause for pessimism right now. I don't necessarily think it totally has to do with the center, however. And that's because I don't just think it's like a restoration, just like a return to the Obama years. It is ideologically, but practically it's not. I mean, Biden just announced a $1.9 trillion stimulus that's not modeled on the old types of stimulus. Like, it involves a lot of needed social spending. It's not just a corporate bailout. It includes $130 billion for school reopenings. And, that's all good stuff. It's going to be infrastructure improvements, a lot of local jobs. We're certainly not going to see anything resembling Medicare for all or any of like the Bernie proposals. That stuff is all, off the table. But I think it's reasonable to expect things like some green infrastructural spending that could be, an opportunity for the left. And just to be clear, I don't think this is evidence of any like ideological shift within the Democratic Party. I'm not saying that. I think it, again, is a return ideologically to the Obama years, but things are different now. And I think that, there's enough like Democratic Party people who can see the economic fallout on the horizon and they don't want to be stuck with it politically. So I think that, there's going to be some spending to avoid some of that. And then second, and probably more importantly, their preferred base, the PMC, the professional managerial class, they are sick of the pandemic and they want their kids to go back to school, So a stimulus that prioritizes, vaccine distribution and reopening schools, it's like playing to the preferred base. So the party's the same, but the historical juncture is different. And so I think that offers some possibility, I guess. But if there is reason for, yeah, please.
Well, just to say, I suppose, I think it does indicate that there's more willingness to spend generally. And that's true of governments of, all sorts of different kind of political complexions across the Western world at the moment, that there's been that recalibration more towards a willingness to spend publicly, particularly if it's of the kind of spending that you mentioned. And I think you're right. It's welcome in as much as it does help things to people to get back into work as much as possible and to restore social life. All of those things would be good, as well as the infrastructural spending.
Yeah, just on that coronavirus point, I've heard or seen, I can't remember who tweeted it. I should have written it down so I can acknowledge my sources, but it seemed to ring true to me. This idea that essentially, right now you've got Biden, he's competent, he has expertise. It's like there's now permission to quote unquote solve COVID. It's okay, things can get back to normal. Like things could never possibly have got back to normal under a Trump second presidency. That would never have happened. And even while he was still in office, it was impossible to do all the things which everybody knows needed to be done. But now the PMC can exhale after a difficult and challenging period and get ready to getting back to normal.
So now we have permission to get back to normal.
Yeah, essentially.
I think one additional thing that's particular to the American context, which has to do with the screwed up way in which the American state spends money, is that this isn't going to be spent through federal programs. It's all going to be devolved to states, which is in general a sort of regressive feature of the American political system. But practically, if like $4 or $5 billion is going to every state for school reopenings, that is a practical opportunity for the left to work at a state level to make sure those funds go towards, the right projects with project labor agreements, stuff like that. So I think there are opportunities certainly. But like I was saying, I don't think it's that's necessarily cause for much optimism. Again, not because of Biden and like what the centrists are doing, but because the left has been like really well disciplined in this whole process, and I think that's the real cause for pessimism right now. The window between Bernie's two primary runs, it was really the time when we should have been building something organizationally, and it's great that an organization like DSA has grown in the meantime, but it's done so very indirectly, and there's been no real organizational gains that have come directly from the Sanders campaign, and that's a real failure. Our revolution tried it the first time around and failed, and I don't even think we're going to see some attempt to use Bernie 2020 data and infrastructure towards building something. I just don't think that's going to happen, which is kind of depressing.
It's an interesting point. We've had, we touched upon it a bit before, But what makes you, I mean, what would you attribute that failure to? How much was it baked in from the start, and how much is Bernie personally to blame for that?
I'm one of those people who doesn't blame Bernie for anything. I saw that cute image of him from the inauguration. I was like, that's my guy. I do think it's a lot of. I think it's largely a reflection of a lack of left organization in the States. I think it's ultimately that the people who
that's just circular, isn't it?
Well, I think that the people who were hired by the Sanders campaign were generally, quote unquote, like progressive Democratic Party people who weren't really interested in the project of the left. And so that the campaign was ideologically like very like liberal left fusionist, and that it didn't really result in any sort of concrete organizational gains at the end. I think those are just both, the products of a campaign that was largely, Democratic Party electoral people.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the thing. For all the talk that there's been on the left of, whether or not to use the Democratic Party opportunistically to run on its ballot, to use the opportunity of a popular candidate like Bernie and to rally behind that, that insertion is always not so much opportunistic, but it's top down, and therefore seems to end up always conforming to the interests and priorities of those at the top. I mean, effectively, the Democratic Party has a more powerful pull in society and in politics, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are enough people in the states on the left who are interested in building an independent power center outside of the Democratic Party. And there are really optimistic signs in some places. Like New York City DSA is very impressive in what it's done at like a local level with like the state assembly. But it's certainly not happening on a national scale. And, as far as the progressive wins go in Congress, those haven't been victories of like independent power centers with like memberships. They've been victories of alternative funding streams through like the Justice Democrats and whatnot. And that's, better than the alternative, which is just the DNC holds the purse strings for everything. But it does indicate some, limitations about the progressive electoral strategy.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing observing this from afar, how much of this stuff seemed to have disappeared almost in a puff of smoke in the course of a year. Like everybody was talking about not just about a political possibility in electoral terms, but a whole perspective on society, which seemed to be, and indeed of history, that, you were charting out a line like, okay, now things start to get good again, or that there's some possibility of a vision where politics comes to matter again. And that seems to have dissipated remarkably quickly. And maybe you think, well, maybe it was flimsier than we thought to begin with. I don't, what's your interpretation?
I mean, it was certainly flimsier than we thought. There's no question about that. But I think it was always that way as well. I think anyone who was, historically minded, like looked at the Sanders campaign and said, yes, absolutely, 100%. But also that like no one in his position, I mean, it's a real historical anomaly. Like no one in his position, with such political stature, should be a prominent national candidate without some kind of like left organization to back him. So it was completely top heavy. It was Bernie at the top and very little in the middle. And now that Bernie's on his way out, we're back in the minor leagues. We've got to have these sort of like local build up at the local level and try to find some way forward with the national organization. But I just don't see it happening right now. And again, I think that's the real cause for pessimism at the current political juncture.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it'll be interesting to see what the lay of the land is, once the Biden administration gets under full swing, just because of the craziness of the Trump period. I mean, not even the craziness in kind of political or policy terms even, but just, I guess, the whole American mind space and media and everything just completely dominated by Trump, basically, in one way or another. But
he's been toppled now. Don't forget, we toppled a dictator. Well, we didn't, but those who voted did, and that's a ray of light, surely, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the thing.
Does,
it's like we can all go back to normal now.
But that's the question. So where are the Trumpists going to go next?
Yeah, actually, I mean, maybe it's more interesting to talk about the right than it is to talk about the left right now. So that's maybe where we should go, because there's actually some interesting and weird and potentially scary things happening. So yeah, Ben, I mean, what do you think is, first of all, I mean, just on a basic level, do you buy this idea that there is a kind of a core of Trumpism which will cleave off, if not organizationally or institutionally, at least, kind of mentally and in its voting habits from the Republicans?
Yeah, I mean, I think more the latter than the former. Organizationally, I think they've proven that it's not much. Yeah, I mean, I guess I sort of think of the fate of like the Trumpist tendency as, not to go back to the left, but very similar to the left within the Democratic Party. There's a really good exchange in the New Left Review's sidecar between Mike Davis and I think it was Thomas Meany, just about the future of the Republican Party. And I guess I feel more drawn to the latter perspective, which is that I don't think the Republican Party is going to be rent by this. I think that especially after the Capitol break-in, they have all the reason in the world to marginalize the Trumpists. And certainly, there's going to be a core of true believers, especially like given that this is not largely, but fueled by online forums, that there's still going to be plenty of people attached to that perspective. But I think, I think that enough Trumpers will return to the fold, will return to the Republican Party. And, another sad thing of the present moment is I think that, in fact, both parties will be stronger for all this. They both had to fend off challenges within their ranks, and I think they're going to be much stronger for it.
Yeah, that sounds really plausible. One of the things that has been probably maybe not discussed enough really is QAnon and the kind of conspiracy theory, myself all twisted up, conspiracy theory wing of Trumpism. Something that I don't think that it's not been discussed at all, because obviously it has, but it's either been maybe brushed under the carpet as kind of, maybe not brushed under the carpet, marginalized or compartmentalized as just a bunch of crazies who should be stamped out, or something which is confluent with the far right and therefore is fascist. But no one's really treating it, not enough, as symptomatic of some broader crisis. So I'm interested what you think about that, Ben. I've got my interpretation, but I want to hear from you, especially since you live in the US. So.
No, I think that's right. I mean, it's a symptom, not a cause. It's a symptom of sort of broader social malaise. And I don't know. I mean, I don't necessarily also think it's like a conspiracy theory wing of Trumpism. Like, I think conspiracy theory and just general ideological confusion in America is like much more prominent than that. I mean, the United States is just a very strange place right now ideologically. Like, people believe like all manner of like really strange things. And this is super anecdotal, but I live in Arizona. I've been here for like 4 or 5 years. And, I've encountered conflicting perspectives that I didn't think could like coexist. I know people who absolutely hate Trump, but are also 100% convinced that the pandemic is a hoax. I mean, I know like hippie pro-Trumpers who will like accost me to talk for like 15 minutes about the healing properties of crystal salt lamps. Just like a really, really strange, it's a strange place right now. It's a strange place in terms of like political ideology. And so, people believe all manner of like conspiratorial things on both the left and the right. And, a lot of like apolitical people as well, who are primarily into the conspiracy theories and for neither Trump or the alternative. And I don't know, I guess I have like just, like you said at the beginning, a standard materialist view here. I mean, it's a symptom of broader social decay and economic insecurity. It's also, to make it specific to America, it's also just a result of the fact that Americans are constantly gaslit by political authorities. going back decades. We're just constantly told one thing and shown another. And so it's like pretty unsurprising that a lot of people in America would take on a paranoid worldview. It just makes sense given the nature of political authority and the media. Yeah.
Do you think that's exceptionally worse in America, in the US, compared to other Western states?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're like very like, I guess I should say I don't know for certain, but just given the audacity of some of the things that happen in America, it's just baffling. Like, even with the vaccine rollout, like very simple things. Like I was arguing with a liberal friend about this the other day, and I was saying, well, Anthony Fauci came out and he said, okay, no one go out and buy masks. Masks are overrated, right? And then 2 months later, he says, actually, everyone get a mask. We need a mask real quick, right? And I said, like, what are people supposed to do in that kind of situation? Of course, they're going to be confused by it. And he said, well, they should have known that the only reason Fauci said that was because there was a mask shortage. They should have internalized that lie. And then when he said that it's okay to buy masks, then everyone should have known that, that's because that we had plenty of masks now. I'm like what? Like, just talk to people like they're adults, like if you do this kind of thing, then you're kind of relying upon this like liberal, rational paranoia that you constantly have to like see the world through. But for most people, like, it makes sense that they're paranoid given that kind of rhetoric.
I mean, it seems to me like you've got, let's put it this way. I mean, generally middle class and generally liberals, but I mean, people who have more identification with the establishment and the two main parties, but particularly the Democrats, I suppose, maybe believe too much. They're too close to the media. They believe in what the media says much more than the general population. And then you've got a swathe of the population who just believes too little, who are not willing to buy into any mainstream narrative. And I was looking at some data on this earlier. I'll actually include the link in the show notes. That shows that that the whole Q phenomenon is much more confused. I mean, it's not a discrete body of believers. There are people who are sympathetic to those views, but who don't identify with Q, or vice versa, who identify with Q and think they're a Q person, but actually disagree with a lot of the ideas. So there's no real coherence even internally to it. To me, what that all looks like is a sort of ungluing of American society and an intensification of anti-politics that was there before. That's something that we've seen around the world, which in its anti-political and I suppose in its more specifically political formulation is a disbelief and mistrust in political institutions, in politicians specifically, but maybe in representative institutions as a whole. The slogan, "They do not represent us," which was probably made first or famously in Argentina in 2001 at the time of the IMF debt crisis, rightly so, targeting the whole political establishment. And that's something that's been generalized across the world now, right? They do not represent us. But what really strikes me about QAnon, to the extent that we can call it that, and to the extent that it's in any way a discrete grouping, but at least that tendency is that it's this radical disbelief or distrust that is not just political, a political kind of withdrawal of investment, but an epistemological one even, that there's just no common ground on which to assert that we believe these same things are true. And that seems to me really stark. I wonder if you see it as stark as I do, or at least that's my impression.
I do. I mean, and in those terms, I think it's really dangerous to have no kind of like common fabric that's holding together American society, insofar as it pertains to political beliefs. And I would agree with you that that the problem is essentially about the dominance of media institutions over communal institutions in American society, that people are either too trusting or too disbelieving of what they hear in the media. And part of the problem there is that they lack associational ties that used to ground American civil society, right? Like unions have been gutted, membership organizations have been gutted. And so people just don't see other people with different beliefs from them outside of, seeing other parents when they pick up their kids from school or whatever. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, the atomization is dangerous and very much an effect of the culture industry in America. Again, anecdotally, I'd like to believe that there's still some commonality beneath all that, however, and that the sort of rending of the American social fabric is a little bit overblown. I mean, I have like QAnon people in my immediate family, and people who like post pictures of their like camo, like semi-automatic weapons on Facebook and whatnot. And like, we still have fine conversations, and I think that anyone who is close with their immediate and extended family and, actually like, goes to Thanksgiving dinners and whatnot and hangs out with them, I think that there's still some commonality there, and that the divisiveness is kind of a media creation, overblown, and that underneath it all, there's still something holding America together.
The Thanksgiving family table, the family?
It's not that bad. It's always complained about, but it's not that bad.
No, I believe you. It felt like it sounds like you're making a pitch, right? I mean, you're saying, it's the family.
It's not just the family, but yeah, I don't think that you should, disavow your Republican uncle.
No, absolutely not.
No, that's fair enough. I mean, I also, my impression is that the partisanship is overstated, and maybe the culture war partisanship, because really partisanship is more, in my opinion, more of a culture war than an actual political or ideological struggle. But that partisanship is overstated. I think that's for those who really bought into the whole thing, right? That's for maybe 60% of the population, that isn't the case. But there does seem to be a kind of a breakdown. Again, maybe not as severe as I initially stated. If what Ben says is right, I think maybe not as profound, but that it's still a kind of some sense of disintegration of American society in a way that, I mean, if we compare to the kind of left criticism that was made in the 1950s or the 1960s of this repressive, completely conformist society, you're a very long way away from that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, on the flip side, since 2016, essentially, I do feel like the willingness to dismiss deplorables on the other side has like grown immensely. And that's a pretty dangerous tendency, to sort of dismiss other human beings as like not worth your time, or as, totally wrong in such a way that they should be punished. I think that's a genuinely dangerous tendency.
Yeah. So maybe we should move on, because I think we might come back to touch on some of these topics when we talk a little bit more about psychoanalysis specifically. But I'd like to hear from Ben, actually. What is Damage? What is Damage magazine? A magazine that the three of us like very much, that we've written for, and we intend to continue doing so. But I think it's obviously got a pretty distinct proposal. So it'd be interesting to know what the kind of project is there.
Yeah, sure. I think the simplest way to describe Damage is as a magazine about ideology and social psychology. Broadly, like about the kinds of pathology in thinking and political action that are, spawned under unequal, alienating social conditions. And just practically, it emerged out of a group called the Society for Psychoanalytic Inquiry. We had been, we've been meeting and, reading and researching together for many years. I think the group was founded in 2013. And, we'll get together all the time and have reading groups and discuss things and send very, very long emails back and forth to one another. And finally, we got to feeling like those long emails should be turned into something more productive rather than just sitting in our Gmail inboxes. And that's really where Damage came from, a desire to sort of turn some of that into a sort of productive forum. And, the group is broadly interested in the interconnections of Marxism and critical theory and psychoanalysis. And that's where the magazine started. But as you all know, it's taken a lot of different directions. I don't want to give the audience the impression that it's only a psychoanalytic magazine, because it's not, and we don't think of it that way, even though it's certainly influenced by the psychoanalytic perspective.
So actually, I had a question about the tagline of the magazine, which I think is really interesting and important. Uncovering damage to subjectivity. What are the major sorts of damage that have been done to subjectivity, presumably to all of our subjectivities? And is this what the, I guess the content of some of the articles is looking to explore?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are like diverse ways in which capitalist society drives us crazy. In some ways, like very explicit, but in other ways, I think the damage goes deeper than that. And I think that psychoanalysis, as one of the sort of materialist psychologies, can be helpful in making sense of the diverse ways in which people become depressed and anxious and hate themselves and hate one another. I don't think it's like any particular direction that we take it in, but we just take psychoanalysis to be useful in sort of understanding the ways in which capitalist society is not simply objectively immiserating and destructive, but more specifically subjectively damaging. That people think in pathological ways in which they reinforce the conditions of their own domination and subjectification. And I mean, as this applies to politics, like ways in which we're clearly just not going to move forward, given sort of existing certain existing political conceptions, and trying to uncover those pathologies as well. And I mean, none of this is meant to be. I think that part of the worry with analytic social psychology more generally is that it's sort of taken on. From an analytic perspective, from a sort of removed distance perspective. And that's not at all what we mean what we intend the magazine to be about. It's sort of like working through unstrategic ways in which leftists shoot themselves in the foot sometimes.
Yeah, and there's probably a lot of content there, because there are a lot of different ways leftists shoot themselves in the foot. Sorry, Alex, I think you were more substantive.
No, actually, I think that might be a good thing to talk about right here. I was going to ask something else, but often critique of the left is understood by other leftists as damaging, as aggressive, basically, or maybe even as narcissistic. So maybe it might be worth saying why critique is necessary, why critique of the left is necessary. That sounds like a big point. Maybe some listeners will be like, well, duh, obviously. And others might be going like, yeah, actually, why do you guys, because I mean, we do it ourselves on BungaCast, seem to beat up on the left. I mean, I would disagree with that characterization, but maybe lots of people do see it that way. So it might be worth to discuss that. Why is it important to critique the left?
Sure. I mean, I guess one thing is just that the left, the contemporary left, is historically siloed. Let's say. I think that most people coming to the left sort of fall into left circles and don't have a ton of appreciation for the history of past leftist struggles. And I think that that's changing. I think, outlets like Jacobin, for instance, are doing a really good job of situating the current leftist project in a broader historical narrative. But I think part of the problem there is that, we're coming out of a kind of coma. I mean, the left has been dead since the 70s, and we're waking up, and all of a sudden, people are confused as to why it's not working right away. And, again, the fact that like unions have been gutted, associational capacity has been gutted in America, NGOs have like increased in number and size and funding. All of these things like mean that left politics today is going to have certain pathologies. And that's not a sort of abstract view. That's just a concrete historical view, just given like what we're emerging from. I mean, I'll say this as well. I do think that there are damaging forms of critiques of the left as well. Like, I think that there are some critiques of the left that are made for the purpose not of improving the left trajectory, but of siphoning, iconoclastic leftists towards like different murkier projects, let's say. So I mean, like with Bernie, for instance, I mean, I think that we've yet to see a solid sort of post-mortem of the Bernie campaign. I'm not sure we ever will. And I think that, there were a variety of articles that came out. I don't think any of them got to the right kind of critique of the Bernie campaign, which was not dismissing it as like, overtaken by the PMCs, but dismissing it for the different unstrategic reasons and the fact that, like I said at the beginning, so much of the campaign staff was taken from the sort of progressive democratic electoral realm. So I do think there are damaging forms of critiques of the left as well, even though in general, I would say with you all that we should all just like be much more willing to criticize ourselves as, for taking unstrategic actions.
I mean, I just wanted to foreshadow a discussion that we're going to have towards the end of this podcast, which actually is probably going to be bonus footage. It's not the right word, bonus content. I hate the word content, but we're wedded to it. There's no other way to get around it. If you have suggestions, do let me know, because I'd rather never use the word again. But we're going to talk more about it on our Patreon. It's patreon.com/BungaCast if you do want to sign up, and please do sign up if you want to hear more about it, because we're going to be talking about the relevance and importance of psychoanalysis today, whether it's right to have psychological critiques of politics, and delve into perhaps the marriage of Marx and Freud and what happened to that marriage. So that's something to come up, but just to kind of maybe provide a little bit of a taster and start that discussion before we turn to other topics first. The critique of the left, yes, fair enough. Maybe you go along with that and say, yes, it's important to have critique. It is a way of advancing things. It's a way of, crystallizing really what's at stake. But I think maybe a lot of people would disagree with a psychological approach to critiquing the left, because that would seem to personalize things. I think I'm just trying to maybe convey what the popular understanding of this would be, that it personalizes matters, that it sets the criticizer up as someone who knows more than the person who's being analyzed, and so the response is always, yeah, well, what have you got, or why are you not afflicted by these very same things?
Yeah, sure, and we absolutely are. I mean, the only way in which like analytic social psychology makes sense as a project is if you're critiquing tendencies that you yourself have. If it's like critiquing, the common people out there, it's just not taken on in the right perspective, I think. But I mean, I'll say this, like, I think that if you are skeptical of the psychological disciplines in general, psychiatry, psychology, the mental health field in general, you've got good intuitions. And, everyone at Damage is well aware that psychology has historically been a tool of oppression. I mean, in some cases, it's explicitly so, as in the case of like industrial psychology. And even when it's, genuinely taken up as like, seeking mental health for patients, it's more often than not about adaptation to alienating social conditions. So like in general, all of the psychological disciplines, including psychoanalysis, have been oppressive. And I think people are right to be skeptical of psychology in general as a perspective. But again, I mean, capitalist societies mess with our minds. They are objectively, of course, immiserating and destructive, but subjectively, we're constantly anxious about paying the rent, anxious about keeping our jobs. We're depressed about the condition of the world. We hate our bosses. We hate, other people. We hate ourselves. There's just a lot of, it's psychologically damaging, sort of as the title of the magazine says, to be a subject of late capitalism. And I think that traditional psychology might not offer the right language for describing that, but we need some language to describe that, or we're just ignoring this very effective mode of domination. And so that's really what Damage is trying to do, trying to outline and provide a language for describing subjective damage that we all experience on an everyday basis.
Sorry, Ben, just really quickly, what do you mean by that psychology or traditional psychology might not have the right language? What's the kind of the issue with it, or the deficiencies in the ways that it might look to describe that experience?
Sure. I mean, I mentioned the case of like industrial psychology, and that's like a specific branch of psychology that is about getting workers to work better, right? So It's unsurprising that like that kind of discipline wouldn't provide a very helpful language. But even more generally, and this is unfortunately the fate of psychoanalysis in America in mid-century. Psychology is generally not. I mean, the understanding of psychological health is not about freedom and autonomy in general. It's usually about adaptation, right? Like people go to therapy not because they want to be free, which is the reason they should go to therapy, but because they want to, get rid of some defective parts of their personality rather than explore the reason that it's there in the first place. And I think that the traditional languages of psychology offer us reasons or offer us ways to get rid of the defective parts of ourselves, rather than trying to investigate their causes.
To manage our behaviors to fit in or to achieve instrumental goals rather than seek freedom. Nice way to put it, I think.
So I think we're going to put a pin in this and we're going to come back to it. Again, that'll be on Patreon. I just want to throw this in there, and not expecting responses on there, but I think it's just a good thing to mull over, and maybe we'll come back to it. But there was a poll by YouGov showing that what do Americans consider the biggest threat to their way of life? And majorities across Democrats, Independents, Republicans, and general population, majority says other people in America. So other Americans are considered to be Americans' biggest threat, by far greater than foreign threats, natural threats, global warming, and so on, and economic forces such as money, trade, and business. So I thought that was really remarkable. And I thought this would be a good moment to bring it up. Maybe we'll come back to it.
I think it was Daniel Bessner that said this on the last podcast, but that's terrifying in terms of what it means for the enhancement of the security state in America. That's a perfect justification for, domestic terror laws, which is kind of terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, you can just play people off against each other, really, which is what they have been doing and what they're doing now. We're getting the Democrat version of 9/11 after maybe the Republican one at the original 9/11. Speaking of the Republicans, let's turn to this. You wrote an article with Justin Guastella, maybe it came out last month, about pro-worker conservatives. We should maybe explore who these people are. So maybe you could explain and maybe give a list of names of who pro-worker conservatives are in the US today. Maybe that terminology will jar even for certain listeners. We did have one of the people that you actually cite in the article on this podcast, the editor of American Affairs, Julius Krein. That was episode 145. If you want to check that out and maybe use that as more evidence or as some more content to relate to in reference to what Ben maybe is about to explain about pro-worker conservatives.
Sure. So, I mean, this is a kind of new tendency on the right. It's people like Julius Krein and Michael Lind of American Affairs, Sagar Enjeti of the show Rising, Oren Cass of American Compass. I think they would, kind of include people like Tucker Carlson in their ranks as well, although I don't think Tucker Carlson would think of himself as part of this movement. And I think the best way to describe them is like, they're economic nationalists, they're political corporatists and social conservatives. Like those are the sort of three baskets that I think about them in. On the economic front, they want, to address the hollowing of the American core and to reshore American jobs. On the political front, they are corporatists. They want to bring business unions and, state officials together to sort of hash out something. And They don't seem to actually support like actually existing unions, but they do theoretically support like labor. And then socially, they're pro-family and against individualism. And yeah, I mean, on the whole, they put on a pretty good show. I mean, they're not free marketeers. They're not xenophobes, from what I can tell. They are not like evangelicals. It's sort of a confusing group for the left because we're used to really hating the right. So they're initially quite attractive, and I think that's why we wanted to write the article, because I think that people who sort of gather these things might be initially attracted to what they have to offer, but we wanted to write the article to say that you shouldn't trust it.
I guess my question, Ben, then was, are they exploiting a genuine political space?
I mean, yes and no. Like, just demographically, there are absolutely conservative working class voters out there, many of whom probably voted for Trump. So I don't doubt that there are people out there. I just think that it's largely, I'll say this. I mean, I think it's largely like post-2016 media creation. I mean, the media came up with this concept of like the regressive white working class. And I think that it was largely, again, a media fabrication, and some of these, DC think tank funded, elite educated people stepped up to represent them. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, yes and no. And I mean, just as far as their like proposed demographic, like the socially conservative, but economically nationalist voter, I think it's a little bit overblown. I mean, I argued this in an article about the problem of cultural liberalism on the left. But if you, I mean, I think that these commentators often like confuse, the typical like woke bullshit, which everyone universally hates, for social liberalism, and these things aren't the same thing. So, people's views in America on gay marriage, on reproductive rights, people are socially liberal on those things. Those are majoritarian positions, and this idea that the working class is out there like believing like illiberal, regressive things, it's just not true. I mean, on certain things like immigration and guns, maybe, but on the whole, I would say that. They are quite socially liberal. It's like a real victory of liberalism.
Yeah.
But what they hate, and what a lot of people hate, what a lot of people hate is like liberal PC culture. And those two things aren't the same thing. Like, you can be pro-choice, pro-gay marriage, etc., and also just like not want, your language policed and to hear like the moralizing of progressives. And I think it's important to point that out, that like they confuse these two things. So like, yes, a lot of people hate the woke stuff, but on the whole, the electorate's quite socially liberal.
Yeah,
so
I think
I
that's
guess,
crucial.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, well made. In your sort of diagnosis, do you think that the problems that they face are going to come in the cultural or the economic domain? Basically, do you think that the issue is that, as you said, that they cast workers as socially conservative when in fact they aren't, for all the reasons you just said? Or will they run into problems basically by not being able to genuinely respond to the material demands that they do articulate, and they do recognize that they might be too costly for the rest of their base in intended coalitions or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, on the culture part, like I said, I think that they overestimate the degree to which like the working class in America is socially conservative. They might be right about like a few issues, but on the whole, like I just don't think that the portrayal makes sense. It just isn't supported in the polls. But on the economic front, yeah, I mean, I think that every example we have of right-wing populism should lead people to believe that they're just not going to deliver. They're just not going to deliver. Trump is the perfect example, but it's happened around the world, like Modi, Orban. They promise, or they run on, some pro-working class demands, and then they get to office and they cut taxes. That's just what they do. Maybe part of it is that they are two-faced. I think that's certainly like part of it. But the thing that we wanted to get to in the article, and I think is like the key point there, is that this has structural causes. Like, it's not just that they're two-faced about it. they think of themselves as like the intellectual vanguard of a socially conservative working class movement, when in fact they're more accurately described as like a political excrescence of social decay. There's a concept that I know you all have discussed on the podcast before, Peter Mayer's void, a lack of like hollowed out party structures, like enfeebled unions, like general disorganization of the working class. And that's what they prey on. So they're able to hive off, right-wing populists are able to hive off a certain segment of the working class, but they do so within this general situation of political demobilization. It's true, I mean, this is something we didn't get into the article. It's true that in 2020, there was a significant uptick in voting. I'm not sure totally what that means. Like, it might just have just been like the mail-in ballots. Maybe it's, it forebodes something positive, but it's not clear that it's replicable. But in any event, it's like 100 million people in America consistently weren't voting. So it was a pretty bad baseline to start from.
I suppose I wanted to push you a bit on this, Ben, because if we're in the process of seeing a realignment, then it doesn't seem to me necessarily that that it has been validated in terms of the incapacity of these kinds of movements and parties, say for the sake of argument, as has already been, there's already speculation about this, say Tucker Carlson is the Republican candidate for 2024, and he makes a much kind of bigger push for articulating this and is also able to deliver in a way that Trump was unwilling or unable to. I suppose so. I agree with you that there are kind of structural limits, obviously, to what this kind of political movement could ever deliver for workers in general. But it seems to me it's a claim that will have to be tested, that people will have to learn it by experience, particularly given that there is so few connections between working class voters, working class citizens, and the left. So whatever theoretical claims might be made about the character of this political movement, realistically, they're going to have very little impact in wider society. And so this is something that will have to be learned. And at the same time, it's certainly been learned about the Democrats, I think. So that has been learned about the incapacity. And as you yourself said, right, the failure of the Bernie campaign to really kind of embed itself effectively, or even to kind of squeeze anything substantial to organize or to squeeze as much as it could have out of the Democrats. So that lesson has been learned on one side, and perhaps it has to be learned on the other as well.
Yeah, I think that you're right to say that they are more sophisticated in how they're viewing like the current political conjuncture than maybe I've portrayed them up until now. Like, they are seeing a process of realigning for is the future, not just like the present of American conservatism. I guess I just don't see the same future that they do. The Republican Party is structurally an anti-tax party. Right? I don't see how you get any kind of like economic nationalist program when the entire structure of the party is devoted to cutting taxes. That's what the Republican Party does. And you might want to say, well, okay, so as similar on the left, where the hope is to sort of mobilize a base that's at odds with its party's establishment in order to push it in a particular direction, you might say, okay, well, let's rely upon the Republican base to push the party in a different direction, right? That like people are realigning and we're going to take those voters and push the party in a different direction. Maybe the Republican Party is going to change pretty drastically, but I've just got some numbers that we quote in the article. Among Republican voters, only 45% approve of unions, as opposed to 82% of Democrats, and only 28% think you should redistribute wealth with taxes on the rich, as opposed to 71% of Democrats. So, how on earth are you going to mobilize that base to fight an anti-tax party? And, again, maybe things are like changing pretty quickly, but that's a pretty bad starting point in terms of
sure. I suppose all I mean is that, I'm certainly not making the case that people that they should Trotskyite entryists and militants should go and try and reorganize the Republican Party. Nothing like that. what I'm saying is that that working class voters, they will have to, and I think they will in due course. And I mean, certainly I think this will be seen in Britain. They will explore those political limits themselves through that process. And I also want to put to you, I suppose, to kind of bend the stick in the other direction a bit, if through the process of, through disillusionment with centre-left parties, social democratic parties, whether the Labour Party in the UK or the Democrats in the US, if you have greater working class disillusionment with those parties and a shift towards the right, and if that cultivates greater political independence on the part of working class voters, and if they're more willing to play the two parties off against each other to squeeze them for whatever they can get in terms of things that can improve their living standards, as it seems to have happened with the Northeast Rust Belt voters who swung from Obama to Trump in 2016. That doesn't seem to me to be a bad thing. If you have a greater tranche of working class voters who have political independence of the two parties and who can maneuver between them. And that's one thing that is a boon of the Tories' victory in 2019 was the shattering of the one-party state, the Labour one-party state, in those northern constituencies that swung from the Labour Party to the Tories. So if there's greater political independence on the part of the workers of both mainstream parties, which will be a kind of a learned, it'll be a dynamic kind of process of experimentation and perhaps bouncing between the two and learning along the way. That doesn't seem to me to be a bad thing.
And sorry, just to throw something else in here as well, probably particularly from the British context, but I think it also applies to the American context and wider as well, is whether the left really wants the working class support. I think there was a recent article in Damage magazine that explored some of these things. Have to obviously plug it. Which is basically like, well, what if the this construction of the working class as socially conservative isn't just from the right? What happens if it's also from the left in a way? So the working class are too xenophobic, racist, fascist, problematic in all these different ways, and the left tacks towards a more moral minoritarian approach. I mean, it seems like there are the conditions there potentially for pretty serious realignment in the British case, at least. Just to throw that in there, what happens if the right are saying come over here and the left are saying get over there?
Yeah, I mean, just to start with Phil's question, I think that if that were, how things were playing out, I think maybe differently of it. But I think the general cycle is that, traditional center-left voters, they take a gamble on the right. They're sick of the Democratic Party. NAFTA was just a disaster for the Democrats, and they're still suffering for it. And they take a gamble on the right. But the right doesn't deliver either. I think that there will be a good deal of disillusionment after the Trump era, and then they don't stay politically active. They become politically deactivated by the whole process, and that's again resulted in the abstention of 45% of the American population, the eligible voting age population in America. And so I don't think it's necessarily an exploration that leads to sort of greater political consciousness, like the process typically results in further political demobilization. George, to get to your question, you were obviously talking about your own article in Damage, which is great. And I agree with the basic thrust of it, which is that the remnants of left populism, now that they have been abandoned by both the neoliberals on economics and I guess Blue Labour in the UK context. I don't think there's a similar group in America really. But now that they've been abandoned, they will essentially take minoritarian positions, and that's like a pretty dangerous political trajectory. Not only because it's part of a greater situation where people are being dismissed on the other side as like deplorables, but also because it's going to, mean the geographical limitation of their political project to very liberal urban centers around, what are nationally minoritarian campaigns, which is not a great situation for the left. I think that I can only speak to the American context. I think there is significant sort of labor-based sort of group in the left in America that is suspicious of and resistant to those tendencies, I guess. And so I think that that's certainly true of a certain segment of the left, particularly the PMC left, maybe. But I don't think it's true of the left as a whole. Like, I think there's enough people who, resist the culture wars and are involved in the labor movement and have better politics than that.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe disagree slightly with Phil's presentation of the dynamic in the UK, and I think it applies to the US as well. Is just that the important dynamic in terms of labor voters, what happened with labor voters in the 2019 election is labor voters, especially the old industrial working class, rather than the new maybe service sector working class, is that they abandoned labor, and some voted for the Tories, and some had previously voted for UKIP, for a kind of right-wing populist party, and then graduated to the Tories. Often that was the trajectory. But the predominant, main important thing is that they stopped voting for Labour, and many didn't vote. And I think that tends to be, people like to talk in the media about like, oh, the left is voting for the right now, and that people are shifting between parties. But we're still in the fundamental, the most important dynamic of today is people dropping out of politics, and that remains to be the case. And that's important, and that's not something to be brushed over. And it might also even open up an opportunity for being optimistic in the way that Phil talked about the working class asserting its political independence, of no longer voting by default for Labour, which is something that's happened across the Western world over 3 decades. But, okay, maybe you want to interpret that as a potentially positive dynamic, fine, but I think it's the dropping out which is more important than the left voting for right, effectively.
No, I take the point that both you and Ben made of, the kind of the alienation, apathy, disgust and withdrawal are significant and troubling dynamics. And I suppose the difference in the case of Britain is that those were kind of electoral districts for Parliament, rather than the idea of the presidential election example that I gave in the US. And so I think, whether people stayed home or whether they voted for the Tories in those districts, some of which had been Labour since their creation, famously, you still had the case that people will draw, I think people will draw lessons, because the Tories are going to invest in those districts. They have to keep them. And they're committing to those public spending promises. And I think, they probably won't go large, and it will be, I'm sure it won't be as much as those constituencies need. But I think, I suppose, I think people will be switched on and canny, and they will realize the dynamic at play. And if they can become swing voters and squeeze the parties for more, to get more for their regions and cities and towns, that seems to me a potentially interesting dynamic. Notwithstanding, I think, notwithstanding the process of people dropping out, which I think will also be, in play as well.
Yeah, Dustin and I didn't really get to this in the article because it was actually written before the November election. But the spike in voting was significant. It was huge. Like, after hovering in like the 50s for a long time, it was something like 65% of the population. It was like a 10-point jump, which is pretty significant. And of course, like, against the constant predictions of Democrats, which is that if you expand the voting population, Democrats will win. It was pretty close. At the end of the day, like, Biden won pretty soundly, in the popular vote at least. But a lot of people turned out, and not all of them were for the Democrats.
Yeah, no, I think that's remarkable. We tried to make a big deal of it when we did our post-election roundup, but it's maybe worth restating. Like, I personally was disappointed that the turnout was so high, not in my heart, because I think it's a good thing that more people are involved in politics, but in my head, because it would be much easier for me to continue on my analytical bullshit, to be like, oh, people are dropping out of politics, people aren't interested in this stupid culture war between Democrats and Republicans. It would have been much easier for me to spin out some fucking article saying, like, let's see, people aren't interested in this stuff. No one's turning out. Turnout remains at 50% or so. And to suddenly be confronted with a fact which, was heartening politically in some way, but which was intellectually like not what I wanted. But I think I still haven't heard a good explanation for exactly what motivated that. It's interesting because it's counterintuitive for me, at least, I guess.
You should have written 2 articles, one which was if there was high turnout, one which if there was low turnout. Just print the one that's accurate straight away.
Yeah, like on the whistle match reports. Write 2 different articles in case team A wins or team B wins. That's it. Yeah, so anyway, I guess that's maybe what they meant about pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, or just being disappointed that your analysis was wrong, but comforted by the fact events went away that you secretly, deeply actually wanted them to. So actually, we're going to continue talking about secret deep desires on these.
And Alex's secret deep desires.
Well, yeah, exactly. Which is only on Patreon/OnlyFans. Patreon.com/buncast. We're going to carry on this conversation. But for everyone else, we're going to leave that here. Thank you very much, Ben. But we hope you'll all catch us over on Patreon for the conclusion to this discussion.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.